Welcome back to Market Shares. In today's business climate, it feels like every company is thinking one quarter at a time. Our guest, Rishad Tobaccowala, is always thinking 10 years ahead of time. He's an author, speaker, and advisor with over 40 years of experience helping companies and leaders navigate change. He has held key roles at Publicis Groupe, advised Fortune 500 companies, and recently authored the best-selling book, you see it right there, Rethinking Work. That's his second. Rishad, thanks so much for joining us. Welcome to the show.
Ben, thank you very much for inviting me. Much appreciated.
Well, you were here on campus recently. You were speaking at the Newhouse School here at SU. You've spoken at a lot of universities over the years. How has your message to students changed over the years as technology and the workforce has also changed?
Well, I think one of the biggest things that have happened over the decades that I've been working, and I've actually been visiting schools for about 20 years, the three biggest shifts have been, one, technology is now enabling students to launch companies and their brands much earlier than they were when I was growing up. Because in those days, you did not have things like TikTok and LinkedIn and Substack and podcasts and everything else. So that was one. So in effect, today, you're more likely to be able to launch a company of one and be more entrepreneurial than you ever were. That also means if you're working for a large company, you can be entrepreneurial at the same time because it doesn't cost a whole bunch of stuff to do that. That's number one. Number two is today students and younger generations of talent have much more information and data than I would have when I started. So there was asymmetric information. My management had the information and I had very little information. Today, I would make the case that the next generation of talent have better and more information than their management does. Okay? Their management knows the old ways. The young generation knows the new expertise, right? And so that's the second one. And the third one that has not changed over the years is that in order to build a world-class career that lasts over time, you have to basically ensure that you are continuously honing your skills. You continuously recognize that you never leave school, even though you do. You may stop paying tuition. You may stop having to go to class. But we are working in a world where, because the half-life of knowledge is declining fast because of AI, it's very important to remain a student for life. This is far more important today than it was before, but it was always important.
Well, on that note, you've kind of written a lot about how there will be fewer roles in the future, fewer full-time roles due to AI. How can students stand out in such a competitive job market where there will be a lot more part-time roles?
I wrote a piece which really basically mentioned the basic belief that I think in the future there'll be fewer and fewer jobs, but there'll be more and more work to be done. So think of yourself as when you all, like when I'm not so old that I had to go to see Mozart at a concert. But let's just imagine that I was old enough and music, the only place to listen to music was you had to go to where the musician was with their musical instrument. And then you had the phonograph record that allowed you to basically listen to music at home, or at least the people who could afford a phonograph record system. Then, and this really dates me, but about 30 years ago, there was something called the Sony Walkman that allowed people to basically listen to music anywhere. Today, now think about how you all listen to music. Yes, some of you all still, for old time's sake, will listen to, a vinyl record that you put on a turntable. But in most cases, we listen to music where the song itself is independent of the other song. It's independent of any media, and we listen through a playlist. And the playlist is the work to be done, the mood we'd like to have, right? Whether we are running or swimming or trying to stay calm. And so we put together music that way. So in the future, there'll be work to be done versus jobs. So think about work to be done as music and jobs to be compact discs or LP records.
Rishad, you had a long career in advertising, over 40 years. I have a lot of friends who are pursuing a career in similar fields, advertising, marketing, and in my conversations with them, they're concerned about the future of those professions. Should they be feeling this way? Should they be feeling concerned as they prepare to graduate?
I don't think they should be feeling concerned. I think they should be aware that the future of marketing and advertising is bright, but it's going to be different. And what I mean by bright, but it's going to be different, is every time there's an advance in technology over the last 40 or 50 years that I've been in the business, it has actually grown the advertising and marketing communication business. So what I mean by that is radio grew the market, television grew the market, internet grew the market, social media grew the market. If you look how big advertising is today or marketing is much bigger than it was before. But what does happen is if you're not willing to respond to change, certain industries become much smaller and decline. So newspapers, magazines, to a certain extent, traditional television. So the idea basically, you should be concerned if you're only looking for jobs in what used to be yesterday's jobs. But you need to be looking for jobs in what is tomorrow's jobs. And also you have to be somewhat concerned that these things are fast moving, so you're going to probably have to switch jobs more than I had to over the years.
Yesterday's jobs took place in the office. You've written a lot about the future of in-person work, especially in your book, Rethinking Work. The office culture that you started in the 80s at Leo Burnett in Chicago, it had the strict 9 to 5, the office hierarchy, the martini lunches. You've kind of written that COVID and other trends have kind of made that office culture obsolete. But now we've seen companies kind of push back into in-person work and demand that employees come back. Do you think that pendulum shift will last?
No. So I believe it's a lack of imagination of management who's pretty useless. So let me give you an example. Let's look at a company that we all admire a lot, Amazon. They're forcing everybody to come back to the office. So I had the opportunity to talk to some of the people at Amazon. And one of them, and I was talking about the future of marketing, and they asked me, what do I think about Amazon asking people to come back to work? So here is my answer. Watch this, okay? Number one, the reason we can work from anywhere. So by the way, I do believe in what I call in-person interaction for people being together, but it doesn't necessarily have to be at the office. But I said you can work from anywhere today. Why? Because of certain things called cloud-based computing. Who is the leader in cloud-based computing last I saw? Amazon Web Services, right? Number two, Amazon is famous for not having PowerPoint decks, but having fact-based sheets that people read before they make decisions. Their CEO, when he called people back to the office, did not offer a single fact. It was all emotion. And third, very importantly, Amazon is really good because it customizes their sites and experience to your experience or to you. They've now created a one-size-fits model for every city, every country, and every level. So what they've just done is they basically said they don't believe in Amazon Web Services, they don't believe in facts and data, and they don't believe in customization, which basically means they are reverting and they're saying they reject all of Amazon's philosophy, which is stupid. So in effect, their philosophy is 180 degrees different. That is not what they were doing it for. They were doing it for because their management wanted to lay off people without severance. And this was the way they could lay off people without severance. My basic belief is the age of bosses, control, and debossification is over. We've entered an age of debossification. Tell the bosses to move away, we need leaders. And right now we're seeing also in America how we don't have leaders. We basically have people with jujubes minds and marshmallow backs.
Back in 2010, you made 10 predictions for the future of work and society. They all kind of came true. You wrote about your belief in social media.
All 10
came true.
Yes.
You were a perfect 10 for 10. You get an A+ here at the Newhouse School. You also predict that brands would embrace environmentalism. How do you think about the future? Forgive the broad question, but how do you make these predictions?
So there are three ways you make these predictions. The first is you cannot actually understand specifically. If you look at those predictions, they were tight, but they were not so tight. Like I didn't mention which company might win. I didn't say what stock to buy, those kinds of stuff. They were broad sort of trends. So what you do is the way you study it is you understand what underlying trends are. So like the reason I predicted the future of work the way I do is not because I have a feeling. That isn't enough, right? I bring some feeling to facts, but I need facts to begin with. And so my book begins with these 5 very powerful trends. One is demographic changes, which is aging and declining populations, technology like AI, the fact that there are marketplaces, and Amazon Web Services is one, but Shopify is one, Uber is one, that allows people for the fourth one to have side gigs and side hustles. More people will have a 1099 in the United States than a W-2 next year. And then COVID basically began to make people realize they could work from anywhere, but they also sort of wondered why were they working for the people they were working for and what they were adding. So you take those 5 trends, put them together, and you can clearly see what the future of work looks like. And when people want to go back to 2019, my basic belief is you have the imagination of a toilet bowl. That makes no sense at all.
You talk about going back to 2019. It's funny, you wrote a book, right? That came out right in 2020,
yes.
right before the pandemic.
Yes, so I wrote a book in 2019 that came out in February of 2020,
right.
January of 2020, called Restoring the Soul of Business, Staying Human in the Age of Data. Now, the reason why people take me somewhat seriously, and this book continues to do well as the first book did, is the first book, remember, was written before COVID, came out before COVID was officially recognized as COVID. So it was January 2020. It was officially recognized in March of 2020. So what does chapter 2 of that book have? How do you manage distributed workforces? So I could see technology saying that it made no sense to have offices the way we do. This is before COVID, right? And guess what my last chapter is? AI. 5 years before anybody talked about it. So now people say, wait a second, every single thing you said in that book actually came true. And this was before NVIDIA and before COVID. So I said, please pay attention. Align your companies and your future to this book versus aligning it to some imagination of your management to go back to 2019.
When you go to headquarters of companies, when you speak at conferences, what do companies in these industries, what do they want to hear about from you more than any other topic?
I think the 3 things they want to learn about is, 1, how do all these changes I speak about enable them to ensure that they can attract and retain talent, which is number 1. Number 2, continue to run a world-class business, because that's very important, because it's a business that they're running. And number 3 is, how do they keep themselves and their business models relevant for the future? So those are the 3 key things, which is, how do I attract and retain talent? How do I keep my business and myself relevant for the future? Which was very important. And how do, while I'm doing that, continue to run a profitable business so I don't go broke? The other day, I was asked by a marketer to explain to them, they just changed the topic on what I was supposed to speak on about 2 hours before I was going there. And you think I had a nervous breakdown? No, I did not. Okay. So what my whole stuff is, they said, can you talk about AI and retail technology, AI in the retail marketplace? So my whole stuff is, I don't know anything about AI in the retail marketplace. How am I going to talk about that? So here's what I do. So I say, I think about it for a few minutes and I say, okay, now I shall do something interesting. So I basically have, subscription versions of both GPT, which is OpenAI Deep Research, okay, and which is cheaper now, the Gemini Deep Research. And I put in my questions, interrogated it, and then waited while I was going in a cab ride to this presentation. 25 minutes, I had 2 McKinsey quality decks ready to share. I didn't share those decks. I walked in and said, you asked me the question, here's where you can get the answer, here's a link to it. I used AI to answer the question. But now let me tell you what I think about their answers. Okay, so isn't that amazing that I could actually do McKinsey quality decks in 25 minutes utilizing AI, and that's nothing to do with generative AI?
Well, I'd love to know, how was that talk received? What did they say?
They loved it, because what they did is what I basically said, the following 4 things. So unlike Ed, I actually believe AI is underhyped, but I'm talking broad AI, not just generative AI. Second is, I believe what AI is going to do is it's going to make knowledge free. And that's pretty amazing. What I was just showing is how it makes knowledge free, right? Third is, I told the clients, but by the way, my presentation was not the deck. My presentation was built around the deck. So it's AI plus HI. So HI is human intelligence, human insight, human imagination, human inventiveness. And they loved that. And I said, look, you're looking at someone who's now on Medicare who figured out in an hour how to answer your stupid question. Imagine if you were a talented student coming out of a university. Imagine if you were a professional like you all are versus me, who's a has-been. Can you imagine what you can do? And that got them all energized.
Rishad, in your talk at Newhouse, you suggested students purchase these subscriptions to Claude or Gemini or ChatGPT to kind of help them.
Yes.
I'll say here, I didn't use either one of them to come up with questions for this interview. Would you have done that?
No, I would not have, because the reality of it is, if I did not have any questions, I would have. And then what I would have done is I would have done it like wrote my second book, the one you have behind you. So I write my own books, I write my own stuff, but because I sell it through HarperCollins and have all this, I hire a coach, which they know, a book coach. So the book coach doesn't write for me. What the book coach does is they prompt me with questions to get me to write. Okay, and then this gentleman takes my answer, and I refer to him in my acknowledgments. He then takes my answers and turns them into a chapter. So it's my writing, but he says, Rishad, you have lots to say, but you don't have to write a book chapter. Let me write the book chapter. You write the stuff. But he gives me 8 questions. For my second book, and he also helped me in my first book, for my second book, we had ChatGPT and Claude and Gemini. I asked all of them to answer those 8 questions. I read the answers, and then I wrote my own stuff. So I would expect for people who are stuck, you should go in, ask them what questions would you ask Rishad, take some of them, and then build on it. Because usually what happens is all of us are very creative, but what's very hard when we are creative is to start with a blank sheet of paper. What AI lets you do is not start with a blank sheet of paper. It gives you stuff to build on.
It's like a good coach. Finally, I should note, in the interest kind of full transparency here, Rishad, that you worked with my dad, Tom, starting in the late 80s at Leo Burnett in Chicago. I'd love to ask you here, what do you remember, if anything, about a campaign you did for Glad trash bags called Gremlins?
It was basically so I found myself having grown up in India when we had no trash bags. There's nothing like trash bags. I came to the US and people were spending money on trash bags. And Gremlins was a very interesting campaign that I got to obviously work with your father on. And it eventually ended up being a campaign that we never eventually aired, if I remember, because it actually had gremlin-like problems.
You were exactly right. You remember it perfectly. My dad said that they were worried that kids would imitate the Gremlins and start popping out of trash bags. It never aired.
Yes. And so it never aired. So I remember we did this and it never aired. And my whole thing is like, what a life. You work on advertising and your commercial never airs.
Exactly. That is what it's like. That is a life in advertising. It is amazing after nearly 40 years, you still remember that campaign so well.
Maybe I remembered your father more than I remember the campaign.
Well, you have gone on to do much bigger things than just working with him and the Gremlins campaign. Sure. And we congratulate you on all of that. And the book is Rethinking Work. It is out right now. And you can also read his Substack, which you have plugged a couple times here already. It is called The Future Does Not Fit in the Containers of the Past. That is pretty aptly titled Substack there. It has more than 28,000 subscribers. You should become one of them. Rishad, thank you so much for your time here.
Thank you again, Ben, a lot.